Hello, chess friends. Mike Copland here from the Royal Rooks of York Chess Club, bringing you another chess lesson. This is from a book. As you know, I like to refer to books to create lessons called Hanging Pawns. Show you the authors. Good collection of games that talk about hanging pawns. And on the board you can see I have set up a position with hanging pawns. If you look at white's c4 and d4, those are hanging pawns, because you'll notice that there's no pawn support on the e file or on the b file for these two pawns. When this happens, and it's mainly c and d, I think you could say it could be on the other side of the board with E and F. I shifted these over and kind of took out a couple pawns here. Those are hanging also. Most of the time it ends up this way, most games. Also take note that you got an isolated pawn here. So those are the features. The hanging pawns can become a problem for, in this case, white, because they're vulnerable. They can't be supported by pawns on their sides, and of course this isolated pawn could be a problem eventually. But there is a strategy for white where he can take advantage of the fact that he does have hanging pawns. For black, being able to have white with hanging pawns allows you a point of attack, which I think is also important to understand. So, let me give you a couple rules, or I should say guidelines from the book, because they are worth noting. So, if you're white in this case and you have hanging pawns, one of the things you do is you strive to avoid captures. You want to keep the pieces, especially the minor pieces, on the board as much as possible, because you're going to need them to support and protect the hanging pawns. In this case, since the pawns are on C and D, and pretty much all the examples are C and D, you want to place your pieces where you could protect your hanging pawn. And in this case, the king being castled in black, here he is on the king side. If you could place a piece on the board like d3, which protects c4 but also attacks h7, that's optimal. That is the best place to have these pieces, so you're defending and attacking at the same time. You want to control the central squares. You have to then, of course, exploit the fact that you have that space. And you'll see here, and I'll use another pawn just to pop it in and out, the control that white has in the center is pretty strong at this point. I knocked the king over. No, I didn't resign. The next thing you want to remember with hanging pawns is you want to prepare to advance one of the pawns, or even both, in order to create a passed pawn. Now, for example, this is not sound, but I'm just going to do this real quick. Let's just pretend that's a good move. I know it isn't. To create a passed pawn in the center, which would be to push the D pawn first in this case, becomes critical. It could become a real thorn in black's side in this case, especially when you're keeping pieces on the board. But you have to be careful that he can't blockade. A knight is a good blockade. A bishop could be used for the blockade, preventing you from moving forward, because if that occurs, then you get lots of attacks occurring on this isolated, even though it's a nice pass pawn, it is still isolated, and it can be a weakness. So that's what you're looking to do. Now, if you happen to be playing on the black side of the board, you want to simplify by getting exchanges done as much as you can. It decreases the advantage of space. I mean, white has a lot more space on the board right now than black, as you can see. So if you start exchanging pieces as black, the advantage of space will dwindle. You want to place the pieces on the board. You want to hinder the progress of the the hanging pawns. You don't want them moving forward. Fianchetto, like here on b7, is quite excellent. If you could get the other bishop on a fianchetto, that's a good place too, because they attack the center and they can help stop the passed pawns from moving forward. You want to coordinate your piece pressure on the hanging pawns. Start getting your pieces in positions where they're attacking the pawns. For example, like the rook down here, a little stretch to reach to the rook, but there he is. And in the case of open squares like e5, it's nice if you can have control of the central pawns, but you're going to have to do it with pieces. You want to put pressure, of course, on the pawn, this pawn here, the isolated pawn, because it's always nice to have that pawn gone, because then, of course, this pawn can become a pass pawn. So white may end up with a pass pawn in the center, but you may end up with a pass pawn way out on the A wing. That's the queenside wing on the A file. And then you'll discover you got an advantage. Again, everything is play and counterplay. So that's the basics of hanging pawns. Now what I'd like to do is go through a couple of games with you, show you some examples. Okay, let's take a look at a game between you and Reshevsky from Zurich 1953. You can see the hanging pawns on c4 and d4. So e3 goes to c3. That's the move. Queen h6 to g5. Now notice that the bishop on a6 and the rook on c8 are attacking the pawn on c4. White has to defend it, of course. d8 is coming up to d7. Excuse me, it's white's move. e2 to f2. Then the rook will move up. d1 to c1. And then d7 to c7. Rook, he moves the rook up. That bishop is pretty well trapped, so he's trying to untrap his bishop, obviously. Now, if you notice, the game is slightly in black's favor, but not by a whole lot. Let's get the next move in, which is queen comes over, and the bishop comes to c1. And look what just happened. Black has a major positional advantage. That rook sitting on c3 is very vulnerable at this time. And here it comes, the move into the center. So what is white going to do? He's got a problem. He's going to start moving. He's either going to move the rook or he's going to start losing pieces here pretty quickly. Well, he decides to take. And then, of course, we have a nice exchange here going on. And then white decides to attack the queen. defending pawns, but more like attacking the queen. It's more important here. C3 moves to B3. There's all kinds of pressure going on here, as you can tell. A1 comes out and, I'm sorry, F1 goes out to take A6. So now we've got an interesting position. But notice even the computer here, it's 9.47 black. That's a queen plus an advantage. And you can see why right there. The rook comes down to C2. It's forking the queen and the bishop. What are you going to do about it? Well, white decides, well, let's do what we tried to do here. We're going to push this pawn forward. Gives up the queen. Continues moving forward. B3 goes to D5. You can't let that pawn queen. That would be bad. And then king takes. This is where the game stops. I mean, two bishops against a queen. Not a real big problem here. So you can see it. So black won because he lined up on the C pawn. He put pressure on it. He was able to get the knight into the center, which attacked the formation of rooks, and that allowed him to win the game. If you want to, you can follow the computer out. Again, I highly recommend this software because it does a beautiful job. And now it's like, well, what are you going to do here? The computer's recommending D5. I'm not sure I would do D5. I might consider bringing my bishop back. I don't know. Either way, black's going to win. So let's conclude this game, and I'll see you in the next game. Okay, we're going to take a look at this game between Karpov and Kasparov, played in Moscow in 1984. You can see the computer gives it a dead even score at the moment. Black does have hanging pawns. So let's watch what happens. First thing is Karpov wants to exchange the queens. And there's a reason for doing that. If you exchange the queens, this poor pawn out here, way out here on A7, see if I get my cursor there, on A7 becomes very vulnerable. It's going to be very hard to defend that piece. Well, black doesn't want the exchange. He's going to let white do it. If white does the exchange, then of course the hanging pawns are gone, and that isolated A pawn also is gone. So, of course, white will not do that exchange. He doesn't like it. F1, D1. Well, time to dogpile up on the hanging pawn. He's picked the D1 to go after. And black then turns around and says, okay, all right, I'll give you the trade. So there's the trade. Now you can see how the A pawn is very much exposed and was going to have to be protected. And it's not a pass pawn either, so we'll see where we're going. The position on according to the computer, you notice 0.2 did pretty much equal. F3 to E5 is white's move. And the computer's not picking it up, so let me move it. Ah, my bad. D7, B6, F3, D5. There we go. And then Kasparov moves his king, which is interesting. But as you can see, the computer's saying, yep, that's fine, no problem there. We're going to have an end game coming up pretty soon here. H2 to H3. I think that's a good move because you're worried about potential back rank mates. Not that it's going to happen. A7 to A6. It's almost like they're not sure what they want to do here. e2 to f3. So white is now bearing down on the d4 pawn, I'm sorry, d5 pawn. He's got 4 pieces attacking. Black has what? 1, 2, 3 defending. So he's going to have to do something about that. b7 to a8. White has a slight advantage here. This gives protection to the bishop. That b7 bishop was just kind of hanging out there. If the things opened up and the lines opened up, that could have been a problem. So he's going to take care of that. e5 to g4. And he's looking for, again, the exchange of pieces to simplify a little bit. You can't blame him for that. You can't take the g4. It says, my notes say you can't take g4. Apparently you can, which is interesting. We can go back and look at that for a second. f6 to g8. And that's kind of a dubious move there. At this point, they agreed to a draw. In 84, they did a lot of draws. Let's go back. So, knight takes g4. Let's look at that for just a moment. Bishop takes e7 check. King takes e7. And then bishop takes g4. Now, it's still got a pretty well stale game. Of course, the nice part is it's going to be hard to double up on the c-pawn, but unfortunately, white is attacking the d5 pawn. He's going to have to move his knight and then probably move the rooks. The two of them agreed to a draw at this point, so we'll leave it at that. But you can see what happened and what the pawn formation is and how Kasparov defended himself. All right, I'll see you in the next game. All right, our next example is from Bronstein versus Averbach, Zurich, 1953. Looking at the position for just a moment, a4 has a knight on it. You probably heard knights on the rim are dim, but in this case, that knight is attacking c5, one of the hanging pawns. So's the rook. Of course, black has it defended by a rook and a bishop. Some opportunities here we have to take a look at. It is actually black to move. And okay, so we're ready here. So black played f6 to e4. Now, he could have gone after a stronger attack. He decided not to. He's probably going to look to get rid of pieces. So d2, white moves d2 to e1. He doesn't want to exchange. Remember, the side with the hanging pawns wants exchanges, get them off pieces off the board. However, the side attacking wants to keep the pieces on the board. The more pieces you have, the better the attack. So you can see that being the reason for e5, knight e4, and why the bishop went back to e1. It's kind of important. c8 to b8. Now we'll attack the queen for a moment, trying to move her out of the way. b3 to d3. And then queen d8 to h4. Now white's got a pretty good position here, it looks like, doesn't it? Well, 1.4, so he's got some kind of advantage here. Of course, black is trying to counterattack. And that's what the illustration of this game shows us. Black is counterattacking on the king side, as I mentioned in the introduction. So what happens here is he does a little sacrifice. H2 to G3. And comes across and grabs this knight. So it's not that big a sacrifice. It's a nice counterattack. E1 to C3. It's now safe to come back out. There's no fear about that A2 pawn just kind of hanging there. It's not a problem at the moment. D6 to E5. Do bear in mind, those of you who are fairly new or to the game, just because you're handed a pawn doesn't mean you should take it. If black takes that pawn on A2, he's way out of the game. And that's going to be a problem. He's got to keep his queen in an attacking mode, not just kind of picking up pawns here and there. All right, so we just did E5. C3 takes E5. And there's the exchange with the rook. And there drops the hanging pawn, at least one of them. Now black needs to compensate himself by taking the pawn. B2 to G to B4. B8 to E8. And this game ended up being a draw. Black does not have a passed pawn. He has a couple of weak pawns. White on the other side, his pawn structure's not so great either. So it makes sense to call it a draw. Okay, last game, an example for hanging pawns, is to demonstrate one of the ways that you can create passed pawns. So when you look at the position, and here it is, black's got a pretty good game here. Unless I set the board up wrong, it looks pretty good. Looks like he's up a piece, doesn't it? Well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. That's because I'm missing a piece. So let's put the extra knight on the board that's missing. Again, the beauty of the software is I can just, bleep, there we go. Much better. Okay, white to move. What he's going to do is he's going to create hanging pawns. Now, the D pawn is isolated. It does make a nice target, but hanging pawns is a much nicer target to work with. So by exchanging the knight on C6, white is going to get himself a wonderful advantage. And then D7 takes. And then B7 takes. There we go. If black would have taken with the rook, then there would have been a rook exchange and still would have ended up with the hanging pawns. So now you got a hanging pawn target to go after. And white is going to seize on that moment. F7 to E8 is a response. F1 to C1. You can see the pressure starting to build. D7 to B7. And then D3 to E2. D8 to E8. That is indicated as a blunder, and I'm not sure why he did that. By the way, this is Petrosian versus Hort, Sarajevo, 1972. I forgot to mention that. The queen comes out to G4. G7. Remember I mentioned at the beginning of this video that fianchetto bishops are very nice to have, especially if you end up with hanging pawns. G4 to D1. F8 the c6. Well, he didn't fianchetto the bishop, but he did protect his king when the queen was out at g4, threatening the checkmate. But he did not fianchetto. All right, f4 takes d5. Now, a question would be, why can't he take back? Notice it's not even there. Well, we'll make that move happen. And you can see a whole bunch of exchanging is going to happen. And then the d5 pawn is going to drop. It's going to be pretty ugly. Again, the buildup was on the c6 pawn. And then you can see how black moved in for the kill. c8 to d8. c2 take. There goes the first one. b7, b8. And you can see now White's got the positional game here. f2, f4. f8, e6, d1, d4. Of course, threatening the checkmate in a couple different squares. And that's where the game stopped. You can see the advantage. The only way around it is f6. And at this point, Black's position is just shot. And he's 2 pawns down, so he's not going to win. Well, I hope you like these examples and the information about the hanging pawns. Again, the Hanging Pawns book is worth it. When you're playing in different games, after you get out of the opening, you start looking for where your opponent has weaknesses. Hanging pawns can be a weakness. They can also be a strength, but most of the time they're a weakness that you can attack. And if you do the attack well, eventually your opponent's position will fall apart, which will allow you to win the game. Again, Mike Copland's here with you at the Royal Rooks of York Chess Club. You can find us on the internet at royalrooks.club. We are trying to start a club on chess.com. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Happy chess!